We face a crisis in today's society, junkyard playgrounds. But first, can you define junkyard playgrounds?
Yes, junkyard playgrounds. Just like the name implies, they're actually playgrounds, but instead of being manufactured, it's just a bunch of junk being thrown into, let's just say, any given area. And then these kids that are taking advantage of this playground are just finding these piles of junk, these yards of junk, and using them to do as they would do on regular playgrounds and play on them.
So what is bad about these junkyard playgrounds?
Well, the biggest bad about these junkyard playgrounds are the risks involved with these junkyard playgrounds. The risks happen because, as the name implies, it's filled with junk. You get rusty nails all over the place, you have piles of tires that are dangerous, you get splintered boards, just to name a few things, and these are great risks to the children's health and safety. And so when you get children playing on these high-risk things, and if one were to get injured, because the fact that these junkyard playgrounds are owned by a government organization or a government body, the parents of these injured children are going to look to sue somebody, and they're going to be suing the government. And to just link into the who's going to reap the consequences of this lawsuit, it's going to be the taxpayers, because the taxpayers are paying into Medi-Cal, insurances, and it's going to come straight out of the taxpayers' pockets.
So Adam, you keep saying the biggest burden is these kids getting injured, but what if these kids don't get injured? What would be the outcome of that?
Okay, actually, interestingly enough to bring that up, what happens if they don't get hurt? A whole lot of bad happens if they don't get hurt. You take the children that don't get hurt, what you're turning them into is a bunch of little risk takers, right? You do it again and again, you play on these junkyard playgrounds, you have your fun, nothing bad happens to you. That's zero consequence, is what we're finding out. Now follow that down the road a bit. Why do you think we have some of the extreme things happening that we do once these people grow up? Maybe it's because nothing bad happened in the beginning. So we basically now have two negatives, not two sides. One side with two different factions. We have the children that negative things outrightly happen to in these junkyard playgrounds, and we have the children that don't outrightly have issues in these junkyard playgrounds that later on grow to develop issues with risk-taking.
So, I feel like we're in a little bit of a rough patch now. We're in between a double bind, between children that are getting injured, that's bad on society, on these playgrounds, but then the children that aren't getting injured, they're growing up with lack of risk management, which is also bad on society. So what did we ever do before this?
Well, funny you asked that, actually. We don't even have to look to what we did before. Currently, right now, we have safe playgrounds that children can take advantage of in a safe manner to, as you said at the beginning, produce good social skills for society. But we also must look at if these junkyard playgrounds are simultaneously existing with these safer playgrounds and parents are deliberately letting their kids go to these junkyard playgrounds, it's a trade-off from them going to these playgrounds that are built, paid for by society, by taxpayer dollars, by government institutions for safe environments. And so that's putting these playgrounds that currently exist to waste, and no one's using them. Instead, they're using these dangerous, very risky playgrounds, and that's just extremely bad for, again, the taxpayers and society as a whole.
So you're saying this is bad for the economy?
Yes, it is. And interestingly enough, it's bad for the worst area of our economy, the lower class, which are obviously going to be the people whose children utilize these junkyard playgrounds. It's not middle and upper class children that are getting injured and falling off of these things and cutting themselves. It's the lower class children, and we already have issues with the legalities of child neglect and child abuse that come from low-income households. All these junkyard playgrounds do is further attempt to substantiate the claims that lower-income families cannot take care of their children.
So you're making all these claims. I mean, there must be some type of standard or standards that is following this. Can you explain that?
Yes, actually, we did apply a standard. We're both rule utilitarianists. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, I would.
And why? Why are you a rule utilitarianist?
See, rule utilitarianism and the idea behind it is finding the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. And what we tend to look for is long-term and solid rules, no deviation from these rules. So the issue isn't looking at all sorts of different children and all sorts of different families and all sorts of different situations and saying, this is good now and this is good here and this is good over here. No, that's not the idea. We're looking into the long term, and that is what all of the standards that we've used for judgment so far have done. We've looked into the long term with the economy. We've looked into the long term with children and their development, their injuries, and their possible risk-taking. We've looked into the long term with basically these playgrounds finding ways to replicate themselves by ignoring the public institutions that we already have. So,
the simple rule that we must be following right now is these junkyard playgrounds can't, I repeat, cannot be a part of a public institution, because, as I said, the economic losses that the taxpayers are going to have to be paying for these injuries is terrible. And yes, these private institutions and stuff, when if issues happen, the lawsuits are between the party at fault, the owning the property, and those that are injured and stuff, but not the government or any public institution. And that's going to be the biggest key issue with dealing with the economy. And as my partner said in this discussion, dealing with the income inequality of how drastically one-sided the lower income families are in terms of having to deal with these issues after the fact when they happen.
So, you heard the arguments from the experts, but let's hear from the children.
I've been on a junkyard playground home for most of my life. I heard that from many kids that Red Sox Hawks are the best.
And I want to be a Peace Corps volunteer.